The inflation targeting central bank will be trying to achieve a future path for inflation consistent with the pre-announced target range. How does the central bank keep inflation on target? When the economy is hit by certain shocks, this may cause the future path of inflation to deviate from target. We have identified two sources of shocks: demand shocks and supply shocks. Inflation targeting has different implications for the response to the different kinds of shocks. The inflation targeting central bank will be trying to achieve a future path for inflation consistent with the pre-announced target range. When the economy feels demand pull and supply push pressures, the future path of inflation may deviate from target. Demand pull pressures work through business cycle channels, so monetary policy that stabilizes inflation can also stabilize business cycles. This is referred to as the golden coincidence. Supply side pressures may require more subtle adjustments. After viewing this segment, you should be able to 1. Characterize adjustment of interest rates in response to monetary policy shocks. As we saw in the last segment, the inflation targeting framework offers a straightforward operating procedure. Raise interest rates when the forecast rises above inflation, and cut interest rates when inflation goes below target. When dealing with demand pull factors alone, monetary policy stabilization is fairly straightforward. There are a variety of demand-side factors that can destabilize the economy and destabilize inflation. If demand increases, then the output gap will increase, which will put upward pressure on inflation. An inflation-targeting central bank will respond by raising the monetary policy rate, and this will dampen pressure on the output gap, which will slow down inflation. Consider the case of Korea in the middle of the last decade. A strong demand-side expansion was putting upward pressure on the output gap based on rapidly accelerating GDP growth. Strong demand pulls headline and core inflation above the 3% target and beyond the range of tolerance. The Bank of Korea responds to these demand-side conditions by raising rates, which pulls down demand. Unfortunately, the onset of the global financial crisis hit before the economy could stabilize. Likewise, a contraction in demand-side factors will push the output gap into negative territory. The decrease in demand then turns the output gap negative, which will slow inflation. If inflation slows below target, the central bank will need to cut interest rates, which will help restore inflation to the target and the output gap to zero. In the last segment, we saw when the central bank cuts interest rates when inflation and the output gap lag, then they're able to ultimately stabilize both. An inflation-targeting monetary policy not only stabilizes inflation, but also stabilizes the output gap when it is affected by demand shocks. This is sometimes referred to as a golden coincidence, which means that there's no trade-off between price stability and business cycle stability. But there may be greater challenges when dealing with supply-side factors. Commodities prices face immense global volatility. This graph shows an index of global commodities prices, including petroleum, foodstuffs, and mineral products. In some years, we see a doubling of commodity prices within a year, and in other periods, these prices might fall just as sharply. Commodities prices feed directly into consumer price inflation. Consider the effect of an increase in commodities prices. This will directly increase inflation. This creates a dilemma for the central bank. If the central bank does not raise policy rates, then inflation accelerates beyond target. If the central bank raises policy rates, then this will push the output gap into negative territory, increase unemployment, and slow economic growth in the face of the supply-side shocks. The central bank faces a trade-off between inflation stabilization and business cycle stability. Consider Indonesia in 2013. For fiscal reasons, authorities removed a price ceiling on gasoline, causing a sudden 20% rise in regulated prices. This had an impact on monetary policy. Core inflation remained stable near the 4.5% inflation target, but the big increase in gasoline prices at the pump led to a sharp increase in inflation to 8%, far above the 5.5% upper bound of the region of tolerance. Despite the lack of effect on core inflation, the central bank felt compelled by the inflation target to raise interest rates. Policy rates were raised from 5.75% to 7.75%. Rising policy rates led to a slowdown, with year-on-year GDP growth declining from 6.2% to 4.9%. We see there is a trade-off between dealing with the inflationary effects of supply shocks and keeping economic growth stable. Consider another example. Beginning in late 2014, commodities prices fell sharply, declining about 50% within a year. This is another dilemma. When commodity prices slow down, inflation declines directly. How should the central bank respond? If interest rates are cut, then this will stimulate demand and increase the output gap, and help bring inflation back up to target, but only by destabilizing the business cycle. The fall in commodities prices would pass through into slow inflation. In the Philippines in 2015, there was an inflation target of 3% with a ±1% tolerance band. Initially, core and headline inflation were within the target band. However, the supply shock pushed inflation well below target, but the core inflation stays near the target range. So, the central bank keeps the policy rate stable at 4%. Headline inflation can be volatile in emerging markets relative to core inflation because such a large share of spending is on food and energy commodities. However, supply-driven changes in the CPI tend not to last long, since commodities often shift to new price ranges but tend to level out quickly. Thus, commodity shocks which have an immediate effect on current inflation may have less impact on inflation over time, and thus less impact on inflation forecasts. There may be an argument, then, for having a limited response to supply push factors and allow inflation to dissipate on its own. However, care must be taken. Since food and energy are a big part of consumer market baskets, the cost of living of workers is exposed to commodity price inflation. Pressure on the CPI may spill over into wage costs. If the central bank does not stabilize the CPI, workers may demand higher wages to stabilize their purchasing power, which will in turn create second-round effects on core inflation. This may create a vicious wage price cycle, which may permanently destabilize inflation in the absence of central bank intervention. Likewise, falling commodity prices put downward pressure on the CPI, and then put downward pressure on wages, which could in turn cause inflation to decelerate. Monetary policy adjustment might be necessary to keep inflation on target. Examine the second-round effects of commodity prices in the Philippines in 2015. There was a direct impact of falling commodity prices on headline CPI, which the central bank did not respond to. But over 2016, there was a continued undershooting of core CPI. Ultimately, the central bank responded by cutting the policy interest rate to 3%. This was sufficient to bring inflation back into the target range. Has the inflation targeting framework achieved its goals? During the late 1980s, Korea and Thailand were struck by persistent swings in inflation, ranging from a level near 3% and accelerating over time to a level near 9% by the middle of the 1990s. Following a deceleration during the Asian crisis of 1997-98, these economies adopted inflation targeting at the turn of the millennium. Though each have experienced short-term instability, both economies have been able to keep inflation relatively stable in recent years. Before the inflation targeting period, the Philippines had highly volatile and very high inflation, often ranging into double digits. After the Philippines adopted inflation targeting, CPI inflation has been ratcheted downward into a range below 4%. Indonesia has had persistently high inflation in the 1980s and 1990s. In 1998, the financial crisis hit Indonesia very intensely. Inflation went off the charts, reaching 50% in a single year. Since adopting an inflation target in 2005, Indonesia has brought inflation down to a range consistently near 5%. It can certainly be said that inflation targeting has been implemented successfully in the Asia Pacific. But is it necessary to achieve stability? Malaysia operates a monetary policy framework with an identical implementation, but a somewhat different strategic structure. The goal of the central bank is to have economic growth consistent with price stability, giving a slightly higher weight to business cycle stability. But most strikingly, Malaysia operates without a clear intermediate target for macroeconomic outcomes. Specifically, Malaysia seeks to implement price stability without a numerical target for inflation. Is this effective? Clearly, Malaysia has also been able to achieve low and stable inflation without a clear inflation target. Historically, Malaysia had lower and more stable inflation, and so they may have been able to benefit from this strong reputation without imposing a numerical target. Now that we've completed this segment, you should be able to 1. Characterize adjustment of interest rates in response to monetary policy shocks. In this segment, we focused on the economy to understand how the central bank keeps inflation on target. When faced with shocks to demand, the central bank can act as a counterweight. When demand is high, the central bank can raise interest rates, moderate demand conditions, and limit the impact on inflation. When demand is low, driving the output gap negative, the central bank can cut interest rates, stimulate demand, and limit disinflation. However, supply shocks create challenges for central banks. If commodities prices increase, this will lead to a temporary burst of inflation. The only way to fight this temporary price acceleration would be to raise interest rates. But raising interest rates would create unemployment in an economy already hit by higher commodity prices. Thus, the central bank faces a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Fortunately, many fluctuations in commodity prices will be short-lived. Given the lagged effect of monetary policy, a central bank may concentrate on maintaining stability in core inflation. However, if the inflationary effects of commodity prices lead to second-round impacts on wages, this will affect core inflation, and the central bank may need to act to maintain price stability. Now that we've seen how central banks use the interest rate to stabilize inflation and hit an inflation target, let's look at some unconventional monetary policy tools that might be used by an economy that is going to be hit with a persistent low inflation rate.